coach, my job, and even my sense of worth. Now, sitting in a rundown Denver motel that charges by the week, I was about to find something that would change everything. I had been eating instant noodles when my plastic fork slipped under the bed. When I bent down to grab it, my hand brushed against a hard surface, something hidden in the dust. I pulled it out, an old brown suitcase with brass corners, the kind people used back when luggage was built to last. A faded tag dangled from the handle. My full name was written on it, Lena Brooks, in my Aunt Evelyn's unmistakable handwriting. Evelyn Price had been gone for almost a year, but when I found the small key taped beneath the suitcase, I knew she had left it for me. Inside were stacks of cash, $70,000, and a note that would shatter every truth I thought I knew. Before the suitcase, before everything fell apart, my life looked ordinary enough to pass for happy. I lived in a small apartment off Colfax Avenue in Denver with my husband, Caleb Turner. The building was old but clean, the kind of place where neighbors nodded in the hallway and left small plants by each other's doors. We didn't have much, but I used to believe we were building something together. I worked as a marketing coordinator at Larkin Company, a mid-sized agency that handled social media campaigns for small businesses. My boss, Peter Larkin, was the kind of man who smiled without warmth, professional, polite, but distant. I showed up every day at 8:30, made coffee from the sputtering machine, and watched the parking lot fill up from my window. It was predictable, safe. And every Thursday night, my best friend Maya Reed would come over with a bottle of wine. We'd sit on my couch, talk about work, men, and dreams that still felt reachable. She'd always remind me how lucky I was to have a husband like Caleb. I believed her, because back then, I still trusted the people closest to me. The first cracks were so small I almost convinced myself they weren't there. Caleb started keeping his phone face down at dinner. He said it was to avoid distractions, but the way he tilted the screen when I walked by made my stomach twist. He began coming home later, claiming he had to meet clients, his shirt smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't his. When I asked questions, he'd smile, that calm, careful smile, the one that made me feel like I was overreacting. "Lena, you've been working too hard," he'd say. "You need to stop assuming the worst." And Maya, she was always there to back him up. Every time I mentioned my worries, she'd laugh softly, swirling her wine. "All marriages have rough patches," she'd tell me. "Don't sabotage something good because you're scared." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe both of them. So I looked away from the signs, the long work trips, the half-truths, the new passwords on his laptop, and told myself that trust meant not checking. I didn't know then that pretending not to notice was exactly what they were counting on. It happened on a Tuesday, one of those gray mornings when the air feels too heavy to breathe. I woke up with a knot in my stomach and a sense that something was off. Caleb had already left for work, or at least, that's what I thought. I tried to push the unease away, but it clung to me like static. By 10 o'clock, I was at my desk at Larkin Company, staring at a social media calendar for a client I couldn't even pretend to care about. My hands were cold, my heart racing for no reason I could name. Finally, I told my boss I wasn't feeling well and left early. Peter didn't ask questions, just gave me a look that made my skin prickle like he knew something I didn't. When I pulled into our parking lot, I saw Maya's silver Honda parked in the visitor spot. She had a key to our apartment, but seeing her car there on a weekday afternoon sent a sharp chill down my spine. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was dropping something off. Maybe Caleb had come home sick. But when I opened the door, the apartment was too quiet except for the laughter coming from our bedroom. Her laughter. I knew that sound. I walked down the hall and opened the door without knocking. There they were, Caleb and Maya, tangled in my sheets, looking like this wasn't the first time. And maybe the worst part wasn't catching them. It was realizing they didn't even look surprised. The weeks that followed blurred together like a nightmare on repeat. I moved out that same day, leaving behind the apartment, the furniture, and the version of myself that still believed in happy endings. I stayed with a friend for a few nights, then another, until the kindness started to wear thin. Everyone meant well, but I could see the unease in their faces, the way people look at a life that's coming apart and worry it might be contagious. 2 weeks later, my boss called me into his office. His words were polished and empty. Department restructuring, budget constraints, nothing personal. He slid an envelope across the desk, severance, just enough to cover rent for a month. I learned later that Caleb had once been Peter's golf partner. The world suddenly felt smaller and much colder. The divorce came next. Caleb's attorney was sharp and ruthless. Mine was tired and underpaid. The judge, Harold Kincaid, barely looked at me as he granted Caleb everything: the apartment, the car, even our joint savings. And then came Maya, standing in court, wearing the navy suit we'd picked out together years ago. She called me unstable, said I'd imagined things. That was the moment I stopped believing this was just bad luck. It was a plan, and I was the target. After the divorce, I drifted from couch to couch like a ghost wearing someone else's life. Friends offered sympathy that came with expiration dates. You can stay as long as you need, they'd say, but by the second week, the tone would change. I could hear whispered conversations through thin walls, people reminding each other that pity has limits. Eventually, I found myself at the Highland Motel on the edge of Denver, the kind of place where nobody asks questions because everyone's got something to hide. The woman at the front desk, Gloria Jimenez, handed me a key attached to a green tag with the number 14 stamped in fading gold. Weekly rate, cash only, she said flatly. The room smelled like old smoke and disinfectant. The carpet hid more stains than it revealed. Dinner was instant noodles, eaten on a squeaky bed while the TV played static-filled game shows. Still, for the first time in weeks, I didn't have to apologize for existing. I had been at the motel for 3 weeks when I found it, the suitcase that started everything. It was late, and I'd just finished a freelance assignment for a bakery's social media page, barely enough to cover another week's rent. My charger slipped under the bed, and when I knelt to grab it, my hand hit something solid. I pulled out an old brown suitcase heavy with dust, the corners tarnished green with age. A luggage tag dangled from the handle, the ink faded but still legible, Lena Brooks, written in my Aunt Evelyn's precise handwriting. My pulse quickened. Evelyn had died nearly a year ago alone in her small house outside Spokane. At her funeral, everyone called her eccentric, paranoid, obsessed with conspiracies. When I turned the suitcase over, I noticed a small plastic bag taped to the bottom. Inside was a key. My hands shook as I unlocked it. Inside were neat stacks of cash, $70,000, and a folded note on yellow paper. The handwriting was unmistakably Evelyn's. "Lena," it began, "this is travel money. The real fortune is waiting at this address. Don't trust Caleb, don't trust Maya. They've been planning this since before your wedding. Finish what your mother started before they silenced her." I stared at the words until they blurred. My mother, Joanne Brooks, had died 6 years ago in a car accident. Or at least, that's what everyone said. That night, I barely slept. I sat on the motel bed, the suitcase open beside me, staring at the stacks of money and the note that felt heavier than any truth I'd ever held. The words kept replaying in my head: don't trust Caleb, don't trust Maya, finish what your mother started. What had my mother been working on? And what did Evelyn mean by silenced? By morning, the choice was clear. I could take the money and run, disappear into another life like Evelyn had warned, or I could finally stop running and find out why they'd destroyed mine. For the first time in months, my fear started to feel like fuel. I packed my clothes, my laptop, and the suitcase. When I checked out, Gloria just looked up from her newspaper and said, "Good luck, honey." I nodded. "I think I'll need it." 2 days later, I was standing in front of my Aunt Evelyn's old house on the outskirts of Liberty Lake, a quiet suburb just beyond Spokane. The air smelled of pine and rain. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The white paint peeling in thin curls, the front porch sagging slightly to one side. It felt forgotten, like the kind of place time had chosen to skip. I unlocked the door with the spare key Evelyn had mailed me years ago, back when she was still sending Christmas cards no one read. The air inside was cool and musty, filled with the faint scent of cedar and old paper. Dust covered everything: bookshelves, framed photos, even the upright piano against the wall. In the backyard, I found the shed. It was newer than the house, with a heavy steel padlock that looked out of place. When I cut it open with the bolt cutters I'd bought at a hardware store, the door creaked like it hadn't been touched in years. Inside, a ladder led down into the ground. The air below was cold, dry, and still. Lights flickered on automatically when I reached the bottom. The space wasn't a shed at all, it was a hidden archive. Shelves lined the walls, filled with boxes labeled by year, and in the center sat an old desk, a tape recorder, and a row of neatly stacked notebooks. My aunt hadn't been paranoid, she'd been preparing. I started with the boxes labeled 2015 to 2016, the years right before my mother's accident. Each folder was meticulous: financial records, lab reports, printed emails, all tagged with color-coded notes. Evelyn had built an entire investigation down here. In the third folder, I found a photograph that stopped my breath cold. It showed my mother, Joanne Brooks, standing at an Ardent Biologics conference 8 years ago. She looked younger, confident, wearing her old navy blazer. But what made my hands tremble wasn't her smile, it was who she was standing with. Caleb Turner. And beside him, Maya Reed. I stared at their faces, both of them smiling, both of them wearing conference badges with the Ardent logo. The photo was dated 2 years before the night Maya introduced me to Caleb at a friend's dinner party. I pressed my hand against my mouth. It hadn't been coincidence. It had been a setup from the very beginning. Under the photo was an old newspaper clipping, "Local researcher dies in highway accident." My mother's name. I remembered the story Black Ice, a truck that lost control. But the police report Evelyn had saved said something else. The brake lines were cut clean, not torn. The case had been closed as mechanical failure. For years I told myself that Evelyn's obsession with conspiracies was her way of coping with grief. Now I wasn't so sure. Every piece of paper, every folder pointed to one thing: my mother had been silenced. And Caleb and Maya, my husband and my best friend, had known about her long before I ever did. When timelines start to twist, the truth usually hides in the bend. Evelyn had left me the map. I just hadn't known how to read it. Toward the back of the archive, I found a small metal cabinet marked audio evidence. Inside were a dozen cassette tapes, each labeled in Evelyn's careful handwriting. One label made my stomach drop: Caleb Turner Victor Hale discussion, Ray, Joanne Brooks. I slid it into the old tape recorder on the desk and pressed play. At first, just static. Then a man's voice, Caleb's clear, confident, professional. "She's getting close," he said. "If Joanne files that report, Ardent's done. We need containment before this gets out." Another voice answered, deeper, colder. "Handle it quietly. We can't afford headlines. If Evelyn's snooping, make her look unstable. You know how to deal with this." My pulse hammered in my ears. There was no mistaking it. The second voice belonged to Victor Hale, CEO of Ardent Biologics, the company my mother had been investigating for falsifying drug trial data. I switched tapes. This one was labeled Maya Dr. Cho. The voices were faint, but familiar. Maya was laughing nervously. "She trusts me completely," she said. "Our Thursday wine nights are basically check-ins." Dr. Serena Cho, Ardent's lead researcher, replied, "Good. Keep it that way until we're finished cleaning the files." I stopped the tape and sat in silence, the hum of the fluorescent lights above the only sound left. Evelyn hadn't been paranoid. She had been the only one brave enough to follow the truth to its end, and she'd left the rest of the road for me to walk. By the next morning, my mind was a storm I couldn't quiet. I needed to know how deep Evelyn's plan went, so I started going through a folder labeled Legal Financial. Inside were letters from a small credit union in Spokane, along with a document titled Brooks Family Trust. My name was listed as the sole beneficiary. I called the number on the letter, half expecting it to be disconnected. Instead, a calm woman answered, introducing herself as Claire from the Wealth Management Department. When I verified my identity, she paused for a long time before speaking again. "Ms. Brooks," she said softly, "your aunt set up a protective trust years ago. The assets are fully liquid and secure." She noted they were to be used in pursuit of the truth. I sat there in stunned silence. My aunt hadn't just left me clues, she'd left me the means to fight. It took me 3 days to gather everything I thought might matter: the tapes, the folders, the photos, every scrap of evidence Evelyn had preserved. I drove to the nearest FBI field office in Spokane and asked to speak with someone about potential corporate misconduct. The clerk at the front desk looked skeptical until I mentioned the name Victor Hale. That's how I met Agent Dana Whitaker. She was in her 40s, calm and sharp-eyed, the kind of person who could see through excuses before you even made them. She listened without interrupting as I laid out everything: the affair, the crash, the recordings, the trust. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "All right, Ms. Brooks, we'll take it from here. But understand, this isn't a movie. It's slow and it's messy." The next months became a blur of process: subpoenas, chain of custody forms, late-night phone calls verifying timestamps. Forensic accountants combed through Ardent's ledgers, former employees were quietly interviewed. I learned that every document, every timestamp, every file name mattered. Agent Whitaker once compared it to building a bridge. Each document is a rivet, she said. Miss one, and the whole thing collapses under pressure. I moved into a small studio near the courthouse and lived off Evelyn's trust, careful and quiet. I didn't post on social media, didn't talk to anyone from my old life. Every few weeks, Dana would call with a brief update: "We're making progress. Don't talk, don't move too fast." It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't dramatic. But slowly the truth began to harden into something unbreakable. 6 months after that first meeting, my phone rang at dawn. Agent Whitaker's voice was steady but charged. "It's happening today," she said. "Stay where you are and don't answer calls from unknown numbers." Then she hung up. By mid-morning, the news alerts started flooding in. Federal agents had raided Ardent Biologics headquarters in Seattle, escorting employees out with boxes of files and hard drives. Cameras caught the CEO, Victor Hale, being led away in handcuffs outside his gated mansion, his expression unreadable behind dark glasses. Then came the ones that hit closer to home. Caleb Turner was arrested at a co-working space downtown. He tried to look calm as cameras flashed, but the tremor in his jaw gave him away. The press called him a mid-level operative in a corporate fraud scheme. They didn't know he was also my husband. Maya Reed was picked up in a Seattle cafe, wearing the same delicate gold bracelet I'd once given her for her birthday. When reporters shouted questions, she just kept repeating I was misled. I didn't know. But the truth was written all over her face. For the first time in a year, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel: relief. Not happiness, not yet, but the kind of quiet that comes after the storm breaks. The trials came one after another, each more surreal than the last. The first was Victor Hale's, held in federal court in Seattle. For weeks, the courtroom was filled with reporters, victims, and rows of lawyers. The prosecution laid out years of falsified data, drug trials manipulated, side effects buried, deaths underreported. Evelyn's archive became the backbone of their evidence. When the tapes played, the room went silent. Hale barely looked up as his voice echoed from the speakers, calm and cold, sealing his own fate. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison, his assets seized, and Ardent Biologics placed under government supervision. Then came Caleb's turn. Smaller courtroom, but for me, it was the real battlefield. I watched from the second row as the recordings of his conversations with Hale played for the jury. The same voice that once told me he loved me was now planning how to destroy my mother's work and my life. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts of conspiracy and fraud, he finally looked at me. Just once. I didn't look back. Maya's case followed. She took a plea deal for cooperation, testifying against Hale and Caleb. She apologized to me through her lawyer, a written statement full of regret and excuses. I never answered. And Judge Harold Kincaid, the one who had signed away everything during my divorce, was quietly indicted for taking bribes from Ardent's attorneys. He resigned before sentencing, his past rulings under review. My divorce judgment was vacated. A formal letter of apology arrived weeks later, typed and signed but still empty of meaning. Justice doesn't heal what betrayal breaks, but it teaches you how to breathe again. The aftermath unfolded slowly, like dust settling after a demolition. Ardent Biologics faced multiple civil suits from patients who had been harmed by their falsified research. The government reached a settlement worth hundreds of millions, and part of it was allocated to establish independent safety oversight for future clinical trials. When my share of the restitution arrived, I stared at the number on the statement for a long time. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like a burden I hadn't asked for. Still, I knew what I had to do. Evelyn had fought for truth, not money, and I wanted to finish what she started. With guidance from Agent Whitaker and a few honest lawyers, I founded the Brooks Price Foundation. Its mission was simple: protect whistleblowers, fund ethical research, and support families silenced by corporate corruption. I made sure my name was never listed publicly. I didn't want credit, I wanted peace. And sometimes peace meant walking away quietly while the world finally saw what had been hiding in plain sight. Looking back now, it's strange how the worst year of my life became the one that taught me the most. Not just about betrayal or loss, but about what survival really means. For anyone listening, I want to share what I learned, not as advice from a stranger, but as a reminder from someone who's been through the fire and made it out breathing. First, timelines tell the truth. When something feels off, write it down: dates, details, moments that don't fit. Patterns reveal themselves when memory fails. Second, pay attention to behavior, not words. A person's habits, how they guard their phone, how they shift their tone when questioned, will tell you more than any promise ever could. Third, isolation is a tactic. If new people in your life constantly urge you to doubt yourself, take a step back. Real friends don't make you feel crazy for asking questions. Fourth, document everything. Keep records, screenshots, notes, It's not paranoia, it's protection. And finally, fight smart, not loud. You don't win battles by screaming, you win by being patient, precise, and prepared. It's been 2 years since the trials ended. I still live quietly in Spokane, in a small house with creaky floors and morning light that spills across the kitchen table. Some days the silence feels heavy, but most days it feels like peace, the kind my mother and aunt never got to keep. I spend my mornings tending to the foundation's work, reading letters from people who found the courage to speak up. Some stories are small, some enormous, but every one of them reminds me why I kept going. I used to think revenge meant making others pay. Now I know it's about reclaiming the power they tried to take from you. Justice isn't perfect. It's slow, and it doesn't always fix what's broken. But the act of standing up, of saying enough, that's where the healing starts. If this story gave you something, hope, courage, or even just a moment of strength, then share it. Like, comment, tell me which moment made you hold your breath. Every reaction helps these stories reach someone who might need them tonight. And if you're new here, subscribe to The Art of Revenge. Because